Welcome everyone to the Chapter 20 lecture on environmental policy and decision making. We're going to talk about 5 different things today: environmental policy issues, development of environmental policy in the US, the development and management of environmental policy, the global commons, and it all comes back to you. So broadly, policy can be thought of as the collective actions of the government to address a societal goal. Environmental policy is the combination of all the laws, regulations, executive decrees, and budget decisions that govern what we can and cannot do to the environment. We know that the global population is growing. Right now, it's more than 7.8 billion, and by 2050, it could be as high as 10 billion. A growing population places stress on the environment, as each additional person consumes natural resources and releases waste products. This results in some policy issues. Should governments seek to limit population growth? Should wealthy countries with low rates of population growth provide funding for population control efforts in poorer countries with rapidly growing populations? And these are ethical concerns, right? But they could become policy issues. And in some parts of the world, some of these things have been legislated as governmental policy. Take a moment, pause the video, jot down your thoughts to these questions. What are the pros and cons of each? Urbanization is a major policy issue. Currently, about half of the world's population lives in urban areas, and by 2050, as many as 70% will live in urban areas. Urban residents have few experiences with the wild world, and often urban residents encounter poor environmental conditions. Cities are warmer than the surrounding countryside, and societal discontent is easily generated. How can urban areas be made healthy and safe places to live? Pause the video and jot down your thoughts here. Growing population and urbanization. This crowded street in India provides a visual reminder of the size of the human population and its urban nature. Globalization and international networks. Nations are interdependent and rely on complex networks that involve alliances, treaties, and other foreign policy mechanisms. Technology allows for the easy flow of material and ideas. Politics, business activities, and social interactions are no longer confined by national boundaries, and organisms are easily spread from one place to another. Some policy issues with globalization are: what policy changes are needed to function in a more interconnected world? And how can one country encourage environmentally necessary changes in another country? Pause the video again, jot down your thoughts for these 2 questions. Globalization and international networks. These cargo ships carry a variety of material and are waiting to pass through the Panama Canal. Disproportionate consumption. The accumulation of wealth by a small minority of the people of the world is becoming an environmental issue. Poor countries point to the actions of rich countries as the cause of many of the environmental problems that affect them, like climate change. Poor countries are used as dumps for hazardous waste, and they're used as a source of low-wage labor. So some issues with this are: what policy changes are needed to allow poor countries and people to benefit more from the use of their natural resources? What policies would move us toward a more circular economy in which material goods are designed to reduce the amount of waste generated? And should national policy include aid to developing nations? Pause the video, write down your thoughts. Disproportionate consumption. So these young people have few of the material possessions considered necessary by people of the developed world. Climate change. Climate change is the most pressing environmental and social issue of our time. The UN has been leading an effort to address climate change. Currently, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions pledged by countries do not reduce greenhouse gases to the level needed to limit climate change. And that results in the following policy issues. Should countries that are meeting their commitment to reduce greenhouse gases develop a policy of punishing non-complying countries? How should U.S. policy be altered to reduce its contribution of greenhouse gases? And should the developed countries provide funding to help developing countries achieve greenhouse gas reductions? Pause the video and jot down your thoughts about each of these three questions, please. Climate change will cause drought in some parts of the world. Biodiversity loss. The number of species being lost is equivalent to the kinds of extinction events previously seen only in the geologic record. Habitat loss, climate change, hunting for food, and conflict with agriculture are common causes of biodiversity loss. Policy issues arising are things like this. Since the preservation of habitat is important, individual countries must institute policies that address biodiversity loss. Climate change is an international problem that requires a coordinated policy involving all the countries of the world. Write down your thoughts here about these 2 points. Removing the trees in this portion of the Brazilian rainforest reduces biodiversity. Development of environmental policy in the U.S. So some historical background on this for you. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her novel of warning, Silent Spring. There were environmental disasters that also happened in the 60s. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught fire. The Santa Barbara oil spill, air and water pollution, fish die-offs in Lake Michigan. And the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, and this led to much legal environmental legislation. Here you can see the Cuyahoga River on fire. And on the right, we see smog blanketing a city. The process of setting policy. Congress, the legislator, passes a law with the general goal in mind, and the president signs it into law. The executive branch includes the president and federal agencies that enforce the laws passed by Congress. Federal agencies establish regulations that determine how the goals of the legislation are met. The judicial branch, consisting of courts, interprets laws, and when there's uncertainty or disagreement about the goals and the requirements of the law. So the legislative branch, the role is that the primary function is to formulate laws. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate must agree on the content of a law. And the House and the Senate committees review a proposed law, and only about 5% of proposed legislation is passed by both the House and Senate and sent on to the President. Here's a diagram that will detail the process of a law being passed. So on the left, we've got things that occur in the House of Representatives. The right in peach, that's where we see things that happen in the Senate. And there is some back and forth between the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then things get passed on to the executive branch here. Either it becomes law or it doesn't. The role of the executive branch. The president either signs the bill into law and puts it into effect, or the president can veto the bill. The various executive branch departments and agencies see that the law is enforced. They establish regulations, procedures, and penalties. Some special powers of the president are that the president selects the individuals who lead these departments and agencies. Individuals appointed by the president must be approved by the Senate, and that these people can direct a department or agency to follow a specific policy by executive order. The role of the judicial branch is they make rulings when questions arise about the interpretation of a law, whether a law is unconstitutional or contrary to some pre-existing law, to whom the law applies, who is responsible for enforcing the law, and the appropriateness of fines or other punishment, the time available to comply with the law, and a multitude of other reasons. Here's a diagram of environmental responsibilities of major agencies to the executive branch. We've got the Department of Health, Justice, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Defense. And there are more still below that. The Department of Energy and State, the Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security. The special role of administrative law. Administrative Procedure Act established general procedures to be used by federal agencies, boards, and commissions when they make rules and make judgments about how a rule is applied or enforced. It requires that notices of the proposed and final rulemaking be published in the Federal Register. The public needs to have an opportunity to comment on new proposed rules. The Administrative Procedure Act also provides standards for judicial review if a person has been adversely or affected or aggrieved by an agency action. Administrative law judges. They're considered part of the executive branch, not the judicial branch, and they're independent of the federal agencies on which they make rulings. The development of the Environmental Protection Agency. It was established to consolidate various environmental functions into one agency. Many laws specifically gave the EPA the responsibility of developing environmental rules. Initially, EPA rulemaking was aimed at very specific outcomes: stop air and water pollution by regulating release by industry, cleaning up contaminated sites. However, more recently, the EPA is more likely to be involved in gradually tightening regulations to make incremental improvements. The role of non-governmental organizations and lobbying in forming environmental policy. These environmental organizations are nonprofits. Donations to these organizations are tax deductible, and they can also receive governmental grants. However, they can also engage in lobbying activities. Lobbying involves activities that seek to influence legislation or administrative action on political issues. It involves environmental organizations, industry and business, scientific and research organizations. Lobbyists represent their organization's views to the government. They monitor developing environmental legislation, and they donate money to support specific members of Congress. Lobbying expenditures in 2019. So oil and gas industry, their top 5 lobby groups donated about $125 million. Oh, these are just from, that's in total, from 191 different lobby groups. Meanwhile, environmental organizations donated about 19 million total. That's a significant difference in lobbying dollars. landmark legislation, the National Environmental Policy Act. This established a national policy that the quality of the environment should be protected, and it required all federal executive agencies to consider the environmental impacts of their decisions. Established the Council of Environmental Quality to oversee the implementations of NEPA and develop and recommend policies concerning the environment to the President. The Council on Environmental Quality established regulations that required an environmental assessment be made before government agencies could undertake a project. And if environmental assessment determined that there was a significant environmental effect, an environmental impact statement, an EIS, must be prepared before any decision was finalized. The global commons. All countries are involved in a global economy in which no country is totally self-sufficient. Our world is a shared space, and we're facing problems that require the cooperation of all of the approximately 200 nations of the world. Although unequal access to wealth and opportunity are not specifically environmental issues, poor countries have fewer resources to deal with environmental issues than rich countries do. The role of the UN. The first UN conference on the human environment was held in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. Come back. And as a result of this meeting, the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, was formed. The Earth Summit on Environment and Development occurred in 1992. And the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, or UNCED, established 27 principles to guide behavior of nations toward more environmentally sustainable patterns of development. The Rio Declaration was a compromise between developing and industrialized countries. Agenda 21 contained recommended actions to address environmental problems and promote sustainable development. This is a non-legally binding statement of principles on the management, conservation, and sustainable development of all types of forests. The role of the UN. So Sustainable Development Goals, created by the UN, are that the agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. It contained a set of 17 goals established, and they provide a status report in 2019 that showed modest improvement in the goals of poverty reduction, health, water availability, land stewardship, and energy availability. Those goals concerning hunger, sustainable consumption, and ocean conservation showed that conditions were actually getting worse. Examples of important international agreements fostered by the UN include the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and their Disposal, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. There are some obstacles to international cooperation. Things like sovereignty. Countries are hesitant to relinquish control of anything to an international body. Economics. Tensions between wealthy and poor countries, and the difficulty to raise money to address problems. Commitment. Political leaders may be pressured to accept agreements that they can't fulfill, and political leadership in countries changes. Enforcement. The United Nations has no power to enforce compliance with international agreements. The UN can ask member countries to impose sanctions on countries that don't comply, but they have no power themselves to enforce them. Sovereignty and international conflict. Here's a map of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And you can see the Nile River flows through Egypt. And then about midway through Sudan, the river forks. And there's the Blue Nile that flows to the east, and the White Nile flows south. And there's conflict among these countries about building a dam on the Nile River. So think of if Egypt were to build a dam here, how would that impact water availability in Sudan and Ethiopia? Yeah, it would have big impacts, right? All right, and it all comes back to you. So no policies, incentives, or amount of information can substitute for individual responsibility when it comes for ensuring for future generations a quality of life that comes from a quality environment. Individuals must get involved in turning choices into action and be held accountable for their actions. In summary, in the U.S., each of the 3 branches of government impacts environmental policy. The late 80s and 90s was a new international concern about the environment in both developed and developing nations of the world. Environmentalism is seen as a growing factor in international relations. And international treaties have been successful, but ultimately it's up to the individual person to act in an environmentally responsible manner. All right, that wraps up the Chapter 20 lecture. As always, if you have any questions, please write them down. Make sure you bring them with you to class or to student office hours so we can discuss. Thank you.